Bienvenidos al cuarto encuentro internacional de estudios surrealistas. Hoy me acompaña Helen Sturm y voy a presentarla en inglés. Vamos a estar platicando en inglés, por lo que van a ver los subtítulos en la parte de abajo de la pantalla. Welcome, Helen.
Hi.
Helen Sturm is a recent Masters of Letters candidate at the University of St Andrews, Scotland, in Museum and Gallery Studies. She grew up in Brunswick, Maine, in the USA, and completed her undergraduate degree in art history and anthropology at the Davidson College in North Carolina. Throughout university, she participated in multiple museological internships, including working in the education department at Farnsworth Art Museum in Maine and assisting an oil painting conservator. She also worked as a gallery and curation intern at Davidson College, and with the university's gallery, she assisted with both public-facing and internal curatorial activities. And we are here with Helen today because she contacted us about some of her research that she was doing recently for her studies. And the name of the dissertation is The Rebranding of Mania, How Museums Market Mental Illness and Madness. And she looked at branding efforts at the Musée or Museum, and with us also here at the Museo Leonora Carrington. And in particular, she researched how both museums dealt with the perceived madness or creative genius of both artists. So I'm very thrilled to speak to you today about this. Helen, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm really excited to speak about it just because your team was so immensely helpful in my research process. So thank you for having me.
No, I think it was very interesting. You held a mirror to our activities and how we think about or through these issues. So could you please, to begin with, tell us how you came into this project? What interested you in this theme in particular?
Yeah, so I think throughout my art history education, I learned so much about the trope of kind of the tortured genius, and how there are so many stories about great artists who lived such kind of sad lives or had kind of tragic backstories that ended up in some way playing a really important part in their work. And as an artist myself, I think I was always really drawn to that because there is kind of this preconception that you need to have some sort of tortured background in order to be successful in art. Or it would help you to have some sort of really sad story to tell through art. And so I think that idea has always been really interesting to me just in my personal life. But then when I really got into my master's program here at St Andrews, I was given the opportunity to look at how those stories were told in a, I guess, museological sense. And so Munch and Carrington are two of my favorite artists of all time. So it was a little bit of a selfish choice.
Well, great for you and great for us as well, because then we
right.
can talk about this aspect of her work, which is fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. So I chose them because I did want to do a really strict comparison of both institutions, and it just had there was so much richness there to look at, especially with gender and the kind of movements that they were working with, and how both of their lives, you know, there was a lot of torment that they experienced, or maybe, you know, depending on how you look at it, maybe we play it up more than it actually was the case, or but I think looking at Munch and Carrington in comparison was really fruitful because their work is so determined by their personal lives, no matter how many years later. It's the way they live their lives and the experience they had still seem to be really relevant to so many people. And so I wanted to really just I was given the opportunity to look at both, and so I was just very lucky in that. I was it was just more, it was a passion project and an academic project. So yeah.
Yeah, and initially I think you had a longer list of institutions, right? So you
Yeah.
had, I think, 4 museums originally.
So originally I was looking at Carrington Monk, Vincent van Gogh, and Georgia O'Keeffe.
Yes.
And it ended up being, the reason why I narrowed it down eventually is because there was just too much for me to say about Carrington and Monk that I really wanted to focus my word count on that. But I think, especially with Carrington, there's just so much mystery that around her kind of identity that I really wanted to break apart. And I think with Monk, it's a little bit different because he's like, he has so many iconic images that seem to be very popular worldwide. And so I think I really wanted to, they seem to be a really good pairing, even though at first glance you wouldn't necessarily put them together. So that's kind of why I narrowed it down.
Yeah, and also you focused on 2 museums which are dedicated to just the one artist. So you didn't go to other museums, you just worked with us in the main, yeah?
Yeah, I didn't really, I wasn't interested in encyclopedic museums really. I mean, it's not that, I think when you think of museums as institutions, you do think of places like the Met or the Louvre, and you know, ones that cover history and you know, the all of human development and civilization. But as someone with an artistic background, I think it really appealed to me to look at institutions dedicated to just one artist's process and history, because I think you gain more by looking at, you know, a collection of one work in its own context and microcosm. And it's also interesting to think about how single artist institutions have to kind of brand or come up with a brand for an individual who is most likely deceased. And so there's almost this kind of myth-making process that these museums are involved in, because you have to, you want the work of the artist to be appealing and to be seen by the public, but you also don't want to capitalize on aspects of their identity that may not be tasteful, or you know, such as
Yes.
things with mental health and things like that. So it just seemed like there wasn't, when I came across this topic, it didn't seem like there was too much research done on it. So it seemed like a really good opportunity.
And in a way, it's strange that it's not something that we hear about more, because I mean, we can think of any number of artists who have been affected by mental health issues. And also we know how this has been weaponized almost, or used as part of the branding efforts you were talking about. So,
Right.
and yeah, and yet we don't hear too much about it. So what did you find? Like, what did you see in both museums about how we represent the artists?
Right. Well, I think what I tried to kind of frame my paper in an idea where your institution, because it's so new, it's not, you know, the Monk Museum has existed since 1960s, you know, it's existed as an organization for a really long time, but it's in the process of rebranding, and it's reopening in the fall. And so I kind of wanted to frame my research in this idea of a rebranding, and where each institution was really consciously looking at how they were telling these stories. And I think one conclusion that I really drew regarding like public perception of both Carrington and Monk is that because there is so much kind of mystery around them, sadness, and I guess one source that really sticks out in my mind is Joanna Moorhead's biography of Carrington, and how she kind of spoke about how whenever she would visit her house in Mexico, there's this kind of like coldness, this kind of private nature to Carrington and her space that kind of kept people at a distance. And so I think when it comes to both artists, people, general audiences really want something to grab onto and to connect with, because they are such mysterious figures. And so I think mental health or having some sort of mental crisis can be a really appealing way to get to know these artists, especially because museum spaces are often meant to be, exclude people, and kind of tailor it to certain audiences, middle, upper class audiences, which you spoke about in your interview with me. I think having something so innately human, like a mental health episode or some sort of tragic family backstory, that's a really not easy, but I guess easy and just
it's
simple
an
way.
easy story to sell to people, right? And that's why it's so, at the same time, it's very appealing. And,
yeah.
I mean, there is some merit in it, of course. Like, you see a lot of artists that maybe come from very difficult backgrounds and then they make it. So it's a success story. Or you have someone with mental health issues, but they transform that into creative products that can be shared with other people. So there's a lot of value in that. But at the same time, there is the risk of narrowing a whole person, sort of like shrinking them into this package of just mental health, your mental health or drama story, and then giving that to the audience, and it becomes very reductive. So it's, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think with both Carrington and Munch, because they did so many, not so many, but they have famous self-portraits that, that are most likely they're more recognizable images. And so people love to think of that as, a sharp look into their psyche. And because the scream, is this iconic image of fear and terror. And then, I'm thinking of Carrington's self-portrait, where it's, this kind of sense of whimsy, but confusion. And because it's surrealist, the sense of space is distorted, and there are these, the animals are involved and people don't really understand the symbolism. And so I think because there can be this sense of confusion, it is very appealing to museum staff or curators to really latch on to that aspect of mental health. And I think Munch was more of a victim to that historically. Not, I think Carrington was as well, but specifically with Munch, because the institution has existed for so much longer, it's had more time to really gather this identity of Munch as this tortured, misogynist. So.
And how have they changed their story? I mean, did you find that maybe there was something they used to do they don't do anymore when they tell the story of the artist?
I think one of the primary ways they're trying to change, which I think I haven't seen how it's worked yet because they're not even open. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, they had to delay the opening of their new building. But they are trying to get away from Munch as an individual and move towards Munch as an organization, Munch as this brand, Munch as not just associated with Edvard Munch, Munch is this huge building and organization that can have a lot of different things that happen inside, which is a really interesting museum phenomenon now that, specifically with museum postmodernism and trying to appeal more to community work and opening up the boundaries that are typically in museums, and making sure that the space is being utilized in ways that the community wants and needs. So I think they're using their space definitely differently, but they're also bringing in external voices that help balance the monk-centric nature of their organization. It's so easy just to, they could, have a whole billboard of just the scream and people would know and people would come because people would want to see that image. But instead, I think they're trying to challenge themselves to bring in external artists or talks, which I know that your museum does a lot because I do follow your social media. And I wrote about it in my paper where you don't just bring up Carrington's time in Santander Mental Institution over and over again. It's not, that's, as you said before, that's reductive to her art and her legacy. So I think at Monk, they're just challenging themselves to kind of move away from the iconic images that have been reprinted for, decades now. And I'm excited to see how it goes. I mean, it's such a massive institution.
Yeah, but that's interesting because maybe by just by shifting the focus from the artist to other things that can happen at the museum, you're already telling a different story. And as you were saying, you're bringing in many different voices. So you're approaching maybe the same artwork, the same collection from different perspectives, and they're not necessarily related to the biography anymore.
Right.
So you can see other things about the artist beyond this very appealing story of mental health. Yeah.
Right. And I think specifically in the realm of branding, both Carrington and the Monk Institution it really excites me to see the things that both organizations are doing. Like I know in the interview I had with you, your team discussed the logo and how it kind of relates to that sense of like freedom and restriction and the eye. And then there's a lot of symbolism behind that you don't need to relate that back to her mental health. There's just a lot of, richness there. And I think the Monk Museum, though it's a little late, I think you were kind of doing that already, but, in their new logo, they slanted Monk's name, and then they actually got colors from his works, like reds and greens and, different tones that really spoke to the team to really create this kind of iconic image of Monk that speaks to, the techniques that he used and the colors and the themes, not just the, sense of fear and depression that he wrote about consistently that seems to appeal to people. So there is so much more to gain from each artist. And I think both institutions are moving in a really exciting direction, and it really excites me. So
what was the background literature you used when you were at the beginning of the project, or maybe you incorporated it as you went along? Was there any big references in your?
So I approached the project as from kind of two distinct areas. So I first went to marketing theory, which to me was new. And that was completely because of the course that I did here at St Andrews. We talked about how to brand museums and how do you sell culture. And so that was one really distinct kind of methodology that I started out with, which led me to kind of the like functionalism and the function of art. Like why do museums need to exist? Why do, when you're marketing or branding any sort of product, you're essentially telling the consumer, why do you need this? Why is this essential to your life? And so when you bring that to the context of museums, you're telling the visitor, you need to be here because of X, Y, and Z. And that all comes down to the resonance that art can have in people's lives. And that's very complicated. And I didn't go too far into the kind of phenomenon of art and its ability to, speak to human experience and express these grand themes. But so that was kind of one aspect, was the marketing and the functionalist kind of frame. And then from there, I really dove right into the kind of the both the biographies and just the exhibition texts of both Carrington and Monk, to see how, because both have just countless voices that have dedicated their different scholars that have dedicated their lives to researching these artists. So I wanted to see how they were presented to the public, because that, most likely people will interact with Monk and Carrington in an exhibition context or in a museum context. So the writers, in addition to the museum staff, are, that kind of first line of defense in creating that brand.
Yes, absolutely. So did you read people like Marina Warner, Whitney Chadwick?
Yeah, I read a lot of text for both, and then I really actually got a lot from Carrington's own writing as well, because I wrote a lot about how I think Carrington, specifically, there's so much external baggage that comes with her, being a woman, being in the surrealist movement, so I wanted to focus on what she says about herself and her experience. And so that also was a really important text that I kind of went to first before reading, I guess, the other exhibition texts. And I also really liked the accounts of, her son. He's written a few things about her, and I enjoyed hearing what he has to say. And then also the Joanna Moorhead book, even though it was more like a popularized history, it was still interesting because it spoke to, her own, how she was perceived from the outside, and then how that contrasts with the inside. So that was kind of where I was coming from.
So what did you find in the writings of someone like Joanna Moorhead about the way she represents Leonora? Because in this case, she is a relative of the person. So
right.
And she met her. She knew her for a number of years. So what did you find there?
That was one of my favorite things that I read, and I think it really spoke mainly to that sense of outsider versus insider. Her whole family kind of thought of her as this outsider before Joanna Moorhead even knew she was related, to her. Before she, there's this kind of myth of Prim, and that she didn't really know who it was. It was kind of this black sheep of the family that, moved from this kind of historic home, wealthy home in England, this very privileged upbringing, who then, her family kind of, I guess, kind of told the story that she left for, to live the life of an artist. She was the black sheep. She just was this embodiment of rebellion. And so I think when she went to meet her and then, lived alongside her, I guess, for short periods of time, it was really interesting to see how that perception that she had been told, both from her family, or even if she had read about Carrington in an art historical perspective, how that was really different from her own personality. And when you think of surrealism, at least when I did, it can be kind of kooky, and it can be kind of there is a lot of subversion of space and time, and there are these big themes. And then when she met Carrington, she was more reclusive and private, even though, and in I guess in being such a private person, that was also an act of rebellion in a sense. But it was just, I think that source in particular, it was just how her expectations were subverted every single time that she would meet her. And it, makes me wish that I could have met her as well, as I'm sure we all wish. But it was exciting. It really spoke to the breadth of the life that she lived, and we probably don't even know half of what went on in her head, and the imagination that she had, and so I don't know, it was just a very I guess important source for me that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and she makes a point of she insists that there is no safety net, right? Like, so
Right.
that's a big point of this book, and it's a very important thing that I think she found in the life of Leonora. That's one of the big lessons. You have to make choices, and
Right.
there's no safe choice. So you better, just believe in yourself and go out there and do what you really want to do, even if there's a very high cost to pay at the same time, because she also insists on that, how she, became separated from her own family, and in the end
Right.
she could never really go back, and they didn't even know who she was.
Right.
In some cases. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a sense of, I guess, fearlessness in her art that is so much different than maybe male artists, because I think with Munch, maybe he kind of, during his lifetime, he knew that he was successful, could see that he would continue to be successful, didn't necessarily need to become estranged from his family. Very different circumstances, and he still was able to be successful. With Carrington, I think she gave up so much to pursue what she knew she wanted for so long. And there are consequences to every action that happens, but hers is just a little bit more weighty, I guess, a little bit more, it's more brave, I suppose, than male stories, just based on the fact.
I wanted to ask you, do you think there's a difference in the way we represent women artists who have mental health issues as opposed to men? Are there any tropes that you identify that maybe become more frequent when we talk about women than men?
Yes, well, there's a long, long history of kind of this idea of the great melancholic man and the holy curse of creativity, and that you can look at so many people that have spoken or have art that are about that. Like there's Dürer, there are men of history like Ajax and Plato and Socrates. They all kind of fall into that category where they were tortured, and yet that allowed them to see beyond their reality into to greater meaning, and that made them more successful in philosophy and art. With women, there's this kind of sense that you can't trust necessarily their experience. There's that kind of trope of the crazy woman in the attic where, you need to keep her locked away. She's not to be trusted. And particularly with, I think surrealism also adds a really interesting twist, because I know that in your interview you spoke about the femme enfant and the ability of the woman, because of, she's kind of this vessel, she's this a source of inspiration, that she can see beyond. I think it's a very distinct difference between how you represent the great, tortured man, and then the kind of tragic, private, tortured woman who, for some reason, always seems to be a little bit madder than the man. And you just don't hear, there aren't as many stories either. I think there's no reason why the same amount of men and women haven't experienced mental illness. especially within art, but the fact that you don't see that as much probably just means that those stories are being suppressed because they're the art would be questioned, or the clarity of their vision would be questioned.
So last time we spoke, we were talking about how we represent the artists in terms of mental health, and it really affects the way you think about the whole project, the whole museum. Many museums dedicated to a single artist, they tend to focus on biography, of course, and the way you write your particular version of that biography, your wall texts or what you put on your website and so on, well, it gets edited quite a lot, and maybe you can emphasize mental health, maybe you can de-emphasize it depending on what you want to do. And I think in our case, we really thought about, she's got such a fascinating life, and we all know the story, and it's a very good hook for the public, for the audience. But at the same time, we wanted to say, okay, we need balance here. We need to also talk about the work, because in the end, we like her because she's an artist, and she left behind sculptures, paintings, and so on. And if we put too much emphasis on the biography, then that won't be good. That's not a good thing necessarily. Do you find when there's mental health issues, we tend to speak too much maybe about the person and less about the artwork?
I think so. I think with mental health, it tends to harken back to childhood experiences, and the classic what your upbringing determines how you function as an adult. And so particularly with Carrington, I think there is such an appeal, as you said, to her story, because she did kind of rebel against these expectations. And so I think that because there is this aspect of mental health in her story, it kind of recontextualizes everything else that she experienced. And I'm not really sure, to be honest, what, if she hadn't been in a mental institution, hadn't written about it, hadn't had these terrible experiences, against her will, I'm honestly not sure what her story would look like, because I think it determines so much of how, when you're taught about Carrington in surrealism or in art history, or every time you're going to have to talk about her experience with and in the mental institution is terrible, because it was against her will. It's experimental, is awful. But it just, once you have that one factor, I think it really is easy to latch onto. And it also just, there's a precedent set for that as well. When you think about other artists, like Van Gogh, who cut off his ear and then eventually committed suicide, those are really major events that tend to bring the visitor or the audience back to their personal life. And so,
yes, absolutely, they're very important, and I think we should speak about them. Like in Leonora's case, mental health could be one of the main topics we talk about in the museum, just as we talk about gender or migration or other things that were very important to her and that you can see in her artwork. But it does tend to overshadow other parts of their lives, So with Leonora, it's just very curious. You can see it in the biographies as well. You have this very interesting story of a young, wealthy girl and then turning into a bohemian, an art rebel. And the story takes you to 4 or 5 different countries. There's war, there's passion, it's a Hollywood film in a way. If you want to tell it like that. And you have also, her stay at the hospital. And then she comes to Mexico, and there's a big silence, because her life here was less eventful.
Right.
But we tend to focus on those few years when she was changing countries every 6 months, and
Right.
she went from the psychiatric hospital to New York and then Mexico, that sort of, because it's very intense. But then
Right.
what about all the other years when she was here from the early 40s up until her death? And I don't think we have a lot of clarity on when she was in the United States exactly. Because, she came and went, she came back to Mexico always.
Right.
And you can see in the biographies that there's a lot less to say, maybe because it wasn't as eventful. But what does that say about the artwork? Maybe she had a lot more time to create.
Right. Well, it's interesting because Munch, the same thing happened to Munch, because his early life, I mean, he had writing as well. And there's a very important translation of kind of his diary from his adolescence and from his early 20s, when he was experiencing, breakups and moving and just mental health episodes. And because there is that writing on it, people focus on the work that was created during that time because there's more of a, I guess, correlation. And then in his later life, a lot of people think that Munch didn't live a long life, but he did, and he continued to make work throughout. And you never see paintings of his from his later life. It was only very recently, I think, there was a show at, I think it was at the Met, somewhere in New York, where they showed his final paintings that hadn't ever really been shown because it was him as an older man, and it was in a stable time in his life. And for some reason that wasn't as appealing to people. And so I think it's interesting from an artist perspective, you want all of your art to be, I guess, considered as part of one long process. And yet, because there's this kind of mental health narrative, a lot of it's thrown out just for the sake of the story. So.
Yeah, and you can see with Leonora something a bit like that. I'm thinking of paintings that relate to Down Below. I mean, the book and some of the drawings and paintings from that time, or maybe later, but they can be related to this particular narrative of mental health. And then later in life, maybe you have more themes such as getting old and thinking about death and the final purpose of life. That sort of theme becomes much more relevant. And her late paintings are not as popular as the earlier ones.
Right. Yeah,
maybe,
I think that's
maybe also because we cannot, bring it back to this narrative of the young rebel and with a mental health problem. Yeah.
Right. I think, with artists too, there's it's often considered where I don't think people understand that the creative process can extend for so many years. I think it's often, you burn very bright and very hot for a very short period of time because of that kind of crazy mental state that you're in. And it's hard to kind of realize, that, this person is an artist and dedicated their life to their work, and that extends beyond that period of time.
And it changes as well. The style changes. Like with Carrington, you have these very slim figures in the earlier years, and then in the later years, you have they're just different, a different shape completely. Yeah.
Right. And I
noticed it's to do with the age of the characters as well. Yeah. They become rounder, and there's a lot more old people in the pictures. You can see that. Yeah.
Right.
Well, finally, I wanted to ask you, in your research, do you think you found anything that we could improve, either to talk more, less, or differently about mental health?
To be honest, the way that I viewed it in talking with, because I also talked to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I never heard from the Van Gogh Museum, actually, so I never got to speak with them, but I did talk to the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum as well. And they're, I would say, a good 10 years behind where your institution is with looking at Georgia O'Keeffe's mental health and even discussing it. That they have they haven't even gotten to a point where they bring that to the public yet, because they don't know how to frame it. I think the sense of mystery is really intimidating, and it's challenging. I mean, it's going to challenge your audience, and museums, need to make money and need to support themselves, and so it can be a daunting task. So from my perspective, I think your museum is one of the ones that is doing something right so far. I think in looking at mental health specifically, I know that you mentioned that you have brought in, external voices like psychoanalysts and things like that. And I guess there's a part of me that I guess would say, if we are going to talk about mental health, there's always an important kind of awareness that may need to be developed about what it means to have a mental illness or that experience, which, might not, it's hard because it sometimes it doesn't seem to be in the mission of the institution. But I think if you're going to bring up topics that are so heavy and dark, and with other institutions that have to deal with artists that have committed suicide and things like that, I think it's important to include resources that kind of help reframe.
Yeah, and to do it very sensitively, because you don't, it's a real condition for many people, and you're talking about a real person, and sometimes when you're branding an artist, it becomes a bit like a fictional character,
Right.
You always have to remember that they were real people. So
I mean, I think there are still many people that experience the type of treatment that maybe Carrington dealt with, that it's against your will. Maybe what you're experiencing is not understood. There's so many factors involved: medication, your relationship with doctors, how do you describe your condition, that I think if you don't have it yourself, that's not something that crosses your mind. And so even though Carrington's story isn't necessarily taking place today, it's still happening. And so I guess I would say that it would be important to bring in resources to do that. But again, that's a huge task, and I don't know how to even start to go about that. But
well, thank you for that. I wish I could keep talking, but I think we will go to the Q&A right now. We have time for maybe 4 questions.
Yeah, that's great.
So the first one says, what do you think about the relation between depression and creativity?
That's a good question. I think that art and the visual arts can often be thought of as an expression of things you can't necessarily verbally say. And there's a lot of symbolism in colors and shapes and textures and things like that can reveal a lot about a person's psyche. And I think for arts for centuries, I mean, that artists have viewed it as kind of this outlet to express things they can't necessarily say publicly. And I think it leads into this misconception that that depression and creativity are interrelated or necessary for the other to exist. And I think it is a great tool to understand kind of things that happen in your brain, and you can look at things like art therapy. I mean, there's proven ways that art can be beneficial for the brain. But it just seems to be more of a way to reveal things that you can't necessarily admit. And there's a lot of heaviness that I think comes with that. And I think it can be therapeutic, but in a very heavy way. But I guess art therapy would be the one link where I really see depression and creativity being used in a good way.
So the next question says, the image of a disturbed artist is mostly helpful or unfavorable for our development? I guess.
Well, I think in the past it's been incredibly helpful. I think it gives these artists more of a mystique to the public, as I've said before. Like I think it is something really appealing to grab onto, and I think, we are human. We are nosy. We want to know about people's relationships and things that they went through. And so when they're disturbed or have something like that, we kind of are curious and want to know, oh gosh, like what was that like? So I think it's been helpful from a museological perspective, because it just gets more people interested. I think nowadays, as your institution is realizing and other ones as well, it's in the long run, I mean, you have to tell more stories than that. And your museum will stay pretty stagnant if that's the only way that you're interpreting your artist. I think that's the issue that the Munch Museum came up with. I think for a long time, they relied on the scream and that kind of classic thinker pose that he had, and this pained individual. They relied on that, but that isn't exciting, and you're not going to get or reach new audiences. And so by expanding both with your institution, with Munch, you can essentially just tell new stories and reach new people. And I think in the long run, that will be important for just the relevancy of the institution. So I guess now it's not incredibly helpful, but it can still play a role. And you still have to talk about it, but it doesn't have to be the one thing that defines it.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. That text we have on the wall is a quote by Leonora Carrington, where she says, we all have access to other worlds because we all dream.
Right.
And I think we chose it precisely to say, when people, they come in and they say things like, well, of course she painted like that. She was crazy.
Right.
Thing you hear. And I think it was just a way of saying, like, okay, look at it from the other perspective. We are all crazy if we look inside our dreams.
Right.
So we can all find it within ourselves. And on the other hand, the mental health issues she had were real and not necessarily every person who has those problems will have a creative output.
Right.
Like yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely easy to categorize someone as crazy and not crazy. And when you really look at that, what
does that mean?
What are the qualifiers? Yeah, what do you need to go through in order to be considered crazy?
Yeah.
And I don't think museums should be creating more boundaries and more categories of people. I think that it's just, and especially that one with the idea of the tortured genius, I think that's just tired. And we, as you said, I think we all have this capacity to feel a huge expanse of human emotion. That's just, we all have that capacity, and art just happens to be a really good way to see that. So I think there's a really exciting, particularly with your institution, but way to use your collection to show people different ways of looking at the world, I guess.
Thank you. So the next question says, the artists we know have a mental illness. Who's your favorite and why?
Well, besides Monk and Carrington, I guess another favorite would be, and besides Van Gogh, I'm a big fan of Austrian artists like Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele, Oskar Kokoschka, and I mean, I could have probably written a whole paper on them as well, but they all kind of have that identity of madness, particularly with Kokoschka. There's a really famous story of him having a doll made of his ex-lover that he carried, that after they broke up, he had this doll made that's life-size, and he brought it to the opera, and he, you know, drove around with this doll, and people, I mean, you know, you're going to see that and you think, yeah, that person's probably crazy. So that in that same vein, I guess, with that movement, particularly, the mental state was a way of getting people interested in the art, and it definitely changes the way that we look at the artist. Like, I don't know, that doll is just a good example where I saw an exhibition of Kokoschka in Vienna, and it was just his artwork, but then the one object they had was the doll, because the doll was necessary for some reason to contextualize the work that he was doing. So I guess those are just a few examples, but there are tons of artists that, Tracy Emin is a more contemporary artist that talks about mental health as well.
Yeah, and how she incorporates that into her own self-branding efforts. Same
Right.
with Chile, yeah. He's representing himself as a tortured artist of some sort. And in that sense, like, nudity acquires psychological weight as well in his work.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think
being exposed, yeah.
I think there would be a lot of interesting conversations that could be looked at how artists cultivate their own identity as a tortured artist. It's not just the museum professionals or the art historians that are generating that. I mean, Monk, you know, just as an example, he specifically wrote about how that was his marketing tactic. That was, you know, that was a well-known, and I think the Austrian artists do that as well. And I mean, Tracy Emin with bringing those themes into her work, you know, that's a conscious decision. And artists, I mean, that's a whole other topic. It's just how, if you're an artist, how do you market yourself? What's going to be, what makes your art successful? And often it could be mental health. So, you know, it could be a good thing, I guess, in that case.
Yeah. Okay, and finally, they're asking, in your opinion, did Leonora overcome her mental health troubles that happened to her in the 40s? Do you think she ever got over it, from what you've read?
I don't think it's possible to ever get, I mean, I've never experienced what she experienced, but I don't think it's possible to ever let go of that. It was such both a bodily and a psychic experience. But I think what appeals to me about her is that, and we've kind of touched on this before, but she lived a full life after that. And I think there can be misconceptions about mental health that, you know, if you do experience depression or anxiety or, you know, bipolar, you know, that can really ruin your life. And I think that was something that really drew me to this topic, you know, years and years ago, is that it can, you know, really have an effect on you. But she continued to create, and she continued to form meaningful relationships, and you know, she cultivated this sense of place in Mexico, and you know, she traveled, and to me, I mean, yeah, she was very reclusive, and you know, in accounts there are like kooky stories that people tell about her that, you know, I'm trying to remember who wrote it. I know there's a story about her taking a shower with all of her clothes on and then coming out, and yeah, and people are like, you know, like that could be seen as this kind of, oh gosh, she never really recovered, did she? But I mean, just the fact that she survived such a brutal experience, I mean, I think that speaks more to her strength than any sort of weakness. She didn't let it destroy her. And I wish that story were, I think it is being told, but I wish, you know, that was seen more, rather than the image of her drenched in her clothes and saying, oh my gosh, what is going on here? More, wow, she's, you know, she is a successful artist that, you know, has a whole museum dedicated to her work. And so I guess, yes, I think that she did overcome it, in that she proved everyone wrong, which I think that was her goal from a very young.
That's why we like Leonora so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us, talking to me today about mental health in relation to these two artists. I think your research has really made us think about how we talk about mental health, and different things we can do to approach the subject, while, you know, not making it like the main thing about the artist, not putting it at the center of how we represent Leonora. So I just want to thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you for having me. It's a huge honor to speak to you. So thank you to your entire team for having me.
And thank you to everyone who's listening today. We'll have more events at the Cuarto Encuentro Internacional de Estudios Surrealistas, the Surrealist Symposium that we're doing here in San Luis Potosí, Mexico. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.